So, good afternoon to everybody. So, we will continue today on the lecture about race ethnicity. But just before I continue here, so yeah, everybody received my email saying that I'm giving a third chance to take exam 3. And at this time, the third attempt, I'm reducing the number of questions from 50 to 40, but keeping the same amount of total points possible, so 20. So because of that, each question is going to be worth 0.5 points instead of 0.4 as before. You don't have to take if you don't want to, but if you take it, I select the option on Canvas to your grade on the exam 3 is going to be the highest grade of all the attempts that you have tried. Some people have been asking me if I would curve the grade for exam 3, and I had already explained that in the syllabus, and I had already explained that in previous emails, that I do not curve any grade. It's against my teaching philosophy. I think that what has to happen is that students have to show me that they study and then they took advantage of the material that we have in the website and follow the content throughout the semester, and then they get the grade that they deserve. And curving the grade doesn't do that because it's giving credit to everybody, including to those people that did not study at all. Some people ask for points for participation. I also don't think that's a fair way to give points. So I will provide points with bonus assignments. As I had mentioned before, I had mentioned that we were going to have 4 bonus points, 4 points from extra questions. And I might increase that. Instead of 4, it might be more. And for example, the quiz that's going to be open today at 4:30 p.m. and it's going to be available on Canvas until tomorrow, 12 p.m. It's going to have 4 questions instead of 2 multiple choice questions. And when you answer them, the first 2 questions, we say that they're worth 0.5, and the last 2 are worth 0 points. But that's how the Canvas system works to give extra credit. So after you guys submit the quiz, if you got the last 2 correct, I will adjust your grade there, right? So even if you get the 4 questions correct, you're still gonna show just 1 point immediately. And then afterwards, I have to adjust it into 2 points. And if you got 1 extra one right, or 3 in total, it might show just 1 point in total, but then I will adjust it to 1.5 afterwards. That's how the Canvas system works. I have been giving feedback for different people in the university about how it could be done much easier, but I think that's not an issue with the university. It's more related to how the Canvas system works.
What's the time limit going to be on the quiz?
The time limit, great question, of this quiz with 4 questions is going to be 10 minutes. Because before we had only 2 questions, so it was 5 minutes, 2.5 minutes per question. So that time of 2.5 minutes per question is going to be the same. So for 4 questions, you're going to have 10 minutes. And in these following quizzes in the next week and in the final lecture day, remember that I will have, in 2 of those, we're going to have short essay questions, right? It's going to be in 2 of the remaining quizzes after this one today. People have been asking me how to study better. They studied a lot and they studied the same way, as hard as they did for exam 3 as they did for exams 1 and 2. And because exams 1 and 2, they were more successful than on 3. I would suggest you re-watching the lecture about mortality, in which I explain the Excel spreadsheet in how to estimate life expectancy at birth. And also the previous lecture in which I go on slides explaining the logic of life tables. So that's how I would suggest. And so I suggest focusing, like giving more attention to the mortality material, but also international migration. And also some people ask about, so what's the other strategy that I thought? Yeah. And just the fact that some people said that the questions were too many questions, 50 questions for 1 hour and 15 minutes. I mean, the interesting thing is that I'm using the same questions this semester as I used in previous semesters. And in previous semesters, the same style of multiple choice questions, the same thing as now. And 50 questions, the students would finish much faster than 1 hour and 15 minutes. So I don't think I'm doing too much different than how it was before. But because of that, instead of 50 questions, in the third attempt of exam 3, you're going to have only 40 questions. So you have more time per question. You going to try something?
Is there any set of questions that will not be on this exam since you're eliminating some of the questions?
I eliminated per item. So what I did, I explained before, is that I have question banks for each sub-item of the 3 chapters that we covered, which were mortality, starting on life table, international migration, the whole chapter, and internal migration until before the analysis of spatial association. And within each one of the subtopics of these 3 chapters, I create one question bank for each subtopic. So for the last exam, for example, for the last attempt of exam 3, if I had chosen like 5 questions related to concepts of internal migration, now I'm choosing 3 or 4. So I reduce the number of questions within each subtopic, but all subtopics will be covered in the same subtopic. So the material that we have now is going to cover all subtopics of the 3 chapters on mortality, international migration, and internal migration. Are these quizzes over material from all semester long or since the last test? The question on the chat. The quiz from today, as I mentioned in the syllabus, quizzes, technically, I could put questions from any point of the semester in the quizzes. I could put from chapter 1 until what we have discussed today. But I have not been doing that because I know that that would be really difficult. So what I have been doing for each one of the quizzes, they focus content that we covered not too long time ago. And so although the syllabus, I could be rougher if I follow the rules on the syllabus, I have been actually focusing the quizzes on topics related to what we just saw. For the quiz that's going to be open today at 4:30 with 4 points, I'm still going to ask questions only about internal migration. So the quiz today is about internal migration. It will not cover topics about race, ethnicity. And so we're going to still, so in these questions about internal migration are questions that were covered in exam 3. So since Canvas randomly selects questions, the similar questions, the same questions could appear to you. And in the third attempt of exam 3, also the same questions could appear to you because that's going to be the third time you're taking the exam. I don't have so many questions in the question bank, so the same questions could appear to you, okay? So that's, so the quiz today is about internal migration, and the third attempt for the exam 3 covers all same topics from the last attempt of exam 3, but it's going to have fewer questions for each one of the subtopics, so we have 40 questions in total. But all subtopics will be covered the same way. Subtopics that had just 1 or 2 questions, they will have similar numbers. I decreased the number of questions for subtopics that had 5 or 4 questions. Cool? Any question? Good. Oh, and thanks. Thanks for all the emails that you guys have sent me. And of course, I enjoy reading more some emails than others, but I'm also here learning And I appreciate all feedback that you might have to me. Patrick?
So I want to ask back on Tuesday, was there any particular section of questions that everyone was consistently missing the same over and over?
It's really hard to look at that on Canvas. I would have to look like each person at a time. But what I saw, it was exactly on the mortality chapter, that it would be more. And also on those questions that had a little bit more text in the categories. So that's usually more in the international migration questions. That's why I'm saying for the mortality, pay a closer attention to the lecture on Life Table that's available on YouTube. For these more like questions that have a lot of words in each one of the categories, now instead of having 50 questions, you're going to have 40. So you're going to have more time to read those questions more carefully, right? But again, the same kind of questions, the same amount of 50 questions. And this time, why I'm giving exactly 75 minutes instead of giving more minutes or less minutes? Because 75 minutes is the length of our class. So I'm just following the standard from 3:15 to 4:30. But I'm giving you a much longer window now from yesterday night until Tuesday, this coming Tuesday at 12 p.m. So you have a few days to study, even more than you have already studied before you take the third attempt, okay? But I mean, Canvas, it's much better looking than eCampus, but some of these things, for example, these extra credit questions and knowing exactly where students missed it, it's not so easy to deal with. And I have to pretty much Google. I think one student asked me about that, about the bonus quizzes, that they were actually not being counted in the system as bonus points. And I agree with the student, and I was just doing Google search to try to understand it. And there is a professor in our department that's part of the faculty senate in the university, and he just by coincidence yesterday asked some feedback about Canvas, and I wrote that suggestion. I mean, this bonus quiz style doesn't make sense on Canvas. But when I Google online, there were criticism about it since 2015. So it has been 5 years of criticism, and Canvas didn't change it. So I don't know if you're going to be successful. Yeah, welcome. Thank you guys for everything. And cool, thanks for your comments on the chat. Now I will talk a little bit about the patterns of race ethnicity in the US. So just going further on our chapter, we discussed in the previous topics within this chapter why race ethnicity is important for demographers, because fertility, mortality, and migration vary by race ethnicity. I also showed how the race ethnicity questions changed over time in US censuses, and how it is right now. And there were even some debates to change it in the 2020 census, but it didn't change it, right? So according to the 2010 census, the non-Hispanic white comprise less than 64% of the US population. And that's the lowest ever recorded percentage of the non-Hispanic white population. And that's related to a topic that we have been discussing here since the beginning of the semester, when I mentioned that if you put all minority groups together, everybody who doesn't self-classify as being non-Hispanic white, all this population will be more than 50% of the American population in these coming years. So since 2000, the Black population has remained around 12%. And the Asian percentage has increased slightly. Persons checking 2 or more races also changed a little. So that has been changed a little bit over time. But the Hispanic population is the one that has been experienced the largest increases, from 12.5% in 2000 to 16.3% in 2010. So the Hispanic population has been increasing proportionally in the highest pace than the other race ethnicity groups. So this is just information based on the demographic, the decennial census in the US from 2000 and 2010. And we see that the percentage of the white population declined from 69 to a little below 64. This is just related to the previous slide. The black population remains around 12%. Asians increased a little from 3.6 to 4.7. Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders did not vary as much, and also American Indians and Alaska Natives. Some other race not as well, and 2 or more races increased a little bit, right? But what has been increasing more is exactly the share of the American population that self-classifies as being Hispanic, 2.5% to 16.3% between 2000 and 2010. Cool? So that concept that I already mentioned, this majority-minority population idea that we have been hearing from demographers a lot in these last years, it's pretty much saying that over 50% of the population is comprised. The majority-minority population concept means that if you put together all minority groups, they will be more than 50% of the overall population. And between 2000 and 2010, the minority population in all 50 states in the US grew faster than the majority population, the majority population being non-Hispanic white. But I also mentioned why this concept is controversial. Because what you're pretty much doing, if you go back to the previous table, is just putting all these different groups here, African Americans, Asians, Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders, American Indians and Alaska Natives, some other race, 2 or more races, and Hispanic, all together in the same group, and saying that all these people here in the same group will be more than 50% in these next years. And then the white and the non-Hispanic white by itself is going to be less than 50%. What's the issue with this idea is that actually these groups here vary a lot within the US. They vary in terms of fertility, they vary in terms of mortality indicators, they vary in terms of migration, and they vary a lot in terms of other socioeconomic indicators. So if you just create this whole group here to say that now you're going to have a majority-minority society, you are kind of like washing out all the differences that actually exist between these groups and are important. And even this group here, 2 or more races, some of these people, they could be white and some other race. I mean, they could be white and black or white and Asian, whatever combination here, but they might not be underprivileged if they are compared to white, because maybe in society they have the same opportunities as the non-Hispanic white population. So you're saying that these people here might be all together with the minority, but in reality, their experience in society might be similar as the non-Hispanic white population. The trend that I have been seeing more recently on studies about demography, instead of putting all these groups together, is to understand subgroups of these populations. The issue, the challenge of understanding the subgroups within each one of these categories is that the sample size can get really small if we are analyzing survey data, right? Of course, this number here is in the thousands, but if you start breaking it down by all the characteristics of people, by sex, by age, by occupation, then you start to have really small sample size. For example, I mentioned to you a research project that I have been working on with Dr. Sakamoto from the Sociology department as well. And we are analyzing within this non-Hispanic African-American group, how the experience of second-generation Nigerian Americans, it's actually better in terms of their outcomes, socioeconomic outcomes and education outcomes than other African Americans, and even compared two whites. So what's going on in that specific research project that we are saying is that some Nigerians, they moved to the US some years ago, and usually there is a huge self-selection there. Usually more wealthy and more highly educated Nigerians, they move to the US in a higher percentage compared to the population that stayed back in Nigeria. And then the children of these Nigerian immigrants, so the children of the Nigerian immigrants are second generation Nigerian immigrants. The second generation Nigerian immigrants, their parents already came to the US with higher earnings, already came to the US with higher educational attainment, and already came to the US knowing English, right? Nigeria, English as the first language, official language. So they come here at home speaking in English with a well-educated and a more wealthier family compared to the overall population or to the overall African-American population. And their children are starting to go into school since they are born in the US, experience American life. So the subgroup within the African-American population, or like more recent immigrants from Nigeria, or to be more specific, second generation Nigerian Americans, are doing better than other people within this group. And what we have been seeing is that they have higher educational attainment even compared to the non-Hispanic white, and even to non-Hispanic Asian, and have earnings similar to the non-Hispanic white population and higher than the non-Hispanic Asian population. In my website, I have like some slides in the link for presentations about this specific project, and you can check it out there. But it's pretty much showing that there is a lot of variation within the subgroups. So putting them all together, we lose that specificity, and you don't understand so much in depth the American population. The same thing happens about Asians. Usually when we talk about Asian immigrants, we usually think them as being overachieving in education and have better earnings, but there is a lot of variation within the non-Hispanic Asian group, depending on the country that they come from, right? So this majority minority concept, majority minority population concept is important for us to understand this whole process that's going on in the US, but it simplifies a lot the experiences of the population by only these two groups separated by race ethnicity. So this long parenthesis is just to explain that this concept can be controversial. But overall, as of 2010, 4 states and the District of Columbia were majority minority. So Hawaii, New Mexico, California, Texas, and the District of Columbia had at least 50% of the population that self-classify as being non-white. They were something else than non-Hispanic white, okay? So by around 2044 in the US, there will be no race ethnic numerical majority. We will all be minorities in the sense that, okay, this idea of how to explain this process is actually better than talking about the majority minority. We're pretty much saying that if you break down by all those race ethnicity groups that we saw in the previous table, none of them will have at least 50% of the share of the population. Everybody's going to be below 50%. So what we are having there is pretty much an increase in diversity in the US. And I think I have mentioned to you already, there is a researcher based at the Brookings Institution, and he's also affiliated to the University of Michigan, William Frey. And he has a book called Diversity Explosion. That is exactly that, looking at American community survey data and census data, and he discussed all these patterns of increasing diversity in the country on this book here, and using exactly census data, American Community Survey, and he shows a lot of like interesting maps of how that varies a lot for different areas within the US. Not only by state, he does it even for lower geographical areas, right? So that's an interesting book to check out. go back here to the presentation. And the Pew Research Center has an analysis in which, based on data from 2008, a record 14.6% of all new marriages were between spouses of a different race or ethnicity from one another. And we already talked a little bit about this when I showed you graphs about interracial marriage rates, right? That it has been increasing a lot in the US. The current immigration pattern is not a wave. So it's not something that is started increasing now. There is a continual movement of people coming to the US from Latin America and from Asia. So this process of immigration, it's not new. It has been there for several decades already. So there is not an increase in immigration in recent years. That's a historical process. Like in previous centuries, the immigration was more from European countries, but in more recent decades, it has been more from Latin American and Asian. So there is not an increase, a surge on immigration to the US. But overall, because now we have a higher share of immigrants coming from Latin America and Asia, we see that the distribution of the population between 1970 and 2010 changed, with the white non-Hispanic moving from 83 to 66%. African Americans kind of being stable, Hispanic increasing from 5 to 16, and a non-Hispanic Asian from 1 to 4. And the projections is what we have been saying, Asian population declining, and depending on each projection, right? In the previous slide, I said by 2044, the non-Hispanic white population will be less than 50%. So depending on each different agency that does these projections for these next years, we don't know exactly which year the whole American population will be less than 50% non-Hispanic white. But that's a general trend that we have been discussing here. African Americans still being stable over time, Hispanics increasing, and we have been saying, like, usually Hispanic population has higher levels of fertility than the non-Hispanic white, but these levels of fertility of the Hispanic population has been declining over time and getting closer to the levels of fertility of the non-Hispanic white population. So the reason that actually we expect them to increase more is exactly because of immigration. And also related to immigration, we expect the share of Asian, non-Hispanic Asian population in the US to increase this next decades. And within the Hispanic group, who are the Hispanics? Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans accounting for more than 75% of the US Hispanic population. So from Central American countries, 70.9. From Mexico specifically, 63%. From South America, 5.5, Caribbean, 15.5. And within the Caribbean, we have that actually overall 92% of immigrants, sorry, not immigrants, of people who self-classify as being Hispanics are Puerto Ricans, and 3.5 Cubans. So yeah, so this paper here, this figure here is showing the Hispanic population. It's not about immigrants, right? We're talking about the Hispanic population, and some, of course, like a lot of this Hispanic population are US born. But it's pretty much to show that most of the Hispanic population in the US have links to Mexico and from Puerto Rico and from Cuba. Okay, so that's like their parents might have been born in Mexico, but they could be born here. So they could be, this includes second generation as well. The major changes in race and ethnic composition in the US are the result of direct and indirect immigration. So immigration has the direct effect because immigrants themselves are added to the population. But then after immigrants come to the US, they also have children. So immigration has this indirect effect because the children of these immigrants are usually classified as being Asian Americans, or as being Hispanics, or as being African immigrants, right? So there's a lot of this, or second generation African immigrants, as the example that I gave just now about Nigerian Americans. So when I moved to the US, I was added to the American population as a resident. So I'm the direct effect of this immigration. And then afterwards, when I had 2 children here in the US, my children are second generation immigrants. And they are the indirect effect of my immigration, right? Of course, they are being born in the US, they are going to school in the US, all in English. They're not going to be perceived as Brazilians or anything. But what this analysis is emphasizing is that when immigrants arrive, their health status, their mortality levels, their fertility patterns will also affect the American population, right? The indirect effect is increasingly important. If the immigrants have higher birth rates than a native population, then the indirect effect will be important, because if immigrants on average have more children than US born population, then the ethnicity, the race ethnicity of the immigrants will keep increasing in the coming years. Hispanics usually have higher birth rates than the overall American population, US-born population, but not Asians. Asians usually have lower fertility rates. But as I mentioned, and I showed you on the fertility lecture in our website, there is I think I showed you there, there's an article on the New York Times, really simple article, not really big data analysis or anything, that shows the fertility among Hispanic women in the US has been increasing. Control F. Extra readings. Yeah, it's going to be here on extra readings, and it's a compressed file. Okay. But yeah, so exactly emphasizing that we usually say that the Hispanic population has higher fertility levels than than US-born Americans, but those rates have been decreasing over time, exactly because children of Hispanic immigrants, when they are raised in the US, they will start also to adapt or to integrate the culture and to assume the same reproductive behavior as the whole society, as the American society. And about that process is the next topic of this chapter, cultural adaptation. In the United States and elsewhere, some form of adaptation typically begins whenever a new group of immigrants arrives, right? So we usually, here in the US, or whatever countries receiving immigrants, there are different ways in which people adapt or integrate to that society. And usually now, instead of using the term adaptation, people have been preferred to use the term integration, because the process of immigrants and how they interact in the society, in the American society, or whatever country that they are going to, they are influenced by the country that they move to, but they also influence the country itself by bringing new food and different style of life and so on, that also affects the country of destination. So the word integration kind of creates this more, this process in which the whole society influences the immigrants, but immigrants also influence the whole society. But just like going to extremes, let's just like think one extreme in which immigrants are completely social isolated from the residents, either through their own volition or through a separatist practice of the whole society. If all immigrants, in a hypothetical case, they move to a specific country, in that specific country, they are either segregated by policies from the host country, or for some reason they just stay living by themselves in a separated area, you have this extreme process of cultural separatism, a complete separation between immigrants and the people born in that specific country. This is just for, this is a really hypothetical case. It's just thinking a case in which immigrants are not interacting at all with the population of the host country. At the other extreme, we could have what is called the cultural amalgamation. A new society culture results from the massive intermingling and intermarriage between two or more groups. That would be a society in which there is no segregation, everybody is interacting with each other, everybody has the same opportunities in the country, all immigrants, and the whole society, right? Both these extremes don't happen anywhere in the world, but it's just good to have this more theoretical example to know that in reality, each country that we analyze in immigration, they are in between these two extremes. Between these extreme processes of cultural adaptation are the pluralism and the melting pot process of adaptation. So we have exactly these two before, the separatism and the amalgamation. And in between these two, we have more realistic ways in which people integrate, immigrants integrate to the whole society. In this process of pluralist adaptation, the society allows its constituted ethnic groups to develop, each emphasizing its own cultural heritage. So it's that process that immigrants go to a specific country and there is no policy or no intervention from the cultural society trying to make everybody being the same. So you create this pluralist society with different cultural behaviors and so on. In the melting pot process, the host and immigrant group share one another's cultures, and in the process, a new group emerges. So it's just pretty much saying that there is this process of a more rapid integration. Here is not saying that's 100% pluralist. It's not, if we get into that theoretical process in which everybody's separated, we would have this case here. If you have that place in which we have 100% of completely integration with a new group, that would be amalgamation. These two terms of pluralism, adaptation, melting pot process, it's something in between the previous two, okay? So these concepts is just good for you to understand that different societies have different patterns of adaptation of immigrants. In the U.S., we usually have a little bit of a process in which immigrant groups, they integrate faster to the American society. Although we still see different groups, we still recognize different cultural behaviors and everything, but it's still, there is a more rapid process of integration. By the second generation of immigrants, those people will look much more like US-born people than the culture of their parents. My wife is American, I'm Brazilian, but my children who were born here in the US, their culture, their behavior, their way of thinking will be much more American than Brazilian. Right? So that's how the American society is. There is he's a journalist at CNN. One day I just saw, his name is Fareed Zakaria. Yeah, that's him. Fareed Zakaria, he's a journalist in CNN. And he was saying that usually when you hear the debate in the American society, that you are creating a society in which you have all these separated groups that are fighting with each other and so on. He says, no, it's exactly the opposite, what's going on here. The American society is so open to immigrants and attracts so much people to share those values of the American culture that second generation immigrants are pretty much really, really similar to third plus generation immigrants in the US, right? They're okay, they are US born, but they are much closer to the culture of the American culture than to the culture of their parents, where their parents came from. Some European countries, for example, as in France, immigrants, even after several generations, they are much more separated, and you have these different groups separated in France than what it is here in the US. So France has more this pluralist approach in which you have more these groups that don't integrate as much into the French society, right? That's not, I'm not saying that one is more positive or negative than other. Canada also has more this pluralist approach, but even though Canada has more pluralist approach, there is not actually tension between all these different groups of immigrants and non-immigrants. In France, there is more tension than in Canada, although both of them have more this pluralist process going on in the countries than the melting pot process in the US, okay? Numerous factors must be present if immigrant integration is to succeed. So, in order for these immigrants to succeed in the whole society, there are serious. Oh, yeah. Yes, I have twins. Did I say that I have just one child? Someone asked in the chat here, didn't you say before that you have twins? Yes, I have twins, a boy and a girl, born in the US, born in Santa Monica 3 years ago when I was a researcher at the Rand Corporation. But they were born here in the US. That's why they are second generation immigrants. But since my wife is American, so you'd say that they are 2.5th generation immigrants, right? That classification that I discussed to you before here, they are closer to be a third than to be actually a second generation because one of their parents is born in the US. The American society must provide the means to make economic and social advancement possible for all Americans. So the idea is that we have been discussing throughout the course, and we always hear in the American society that still you have a lot of challenges to provide similar opportunities for different groups in the US. And if you're talking about immigration, you still have to have opportunities improved the same way for immigrants as we have for US-born population. So in order to increase even more integration, those opportunities have to be there. But what we discuss a lot in this process of integration is that the African-American population that has been here forever, for centuries, they still don't have the same opportunities as other US-born population. So this process of integration is not just a challenge for recent immigrants, but also to people who came here to the US with like generations from like centuries ago, decades ago. So the African-American population, like pretty much all of them born here in the US, and their great-great-grandparents came from Africa at the time of slavery, but exactly because this process of the American society of not giving them good opportunities throughout their lives, it has been passing from one generation to the other. Future immigrants, like in order to have a successful integration, another factor that must be present is that future immigrants must demonstrate a desire to become one of us, change the meaning of us in the process. And that's what I was saying that the American society, it's really good at. Because the American society really attracts people to share those values of the American society. But still, we have discrimination going on in the country, so that's a challenge. That discrimination did not end, and by not ending, by not overcoming that issue, the process of integration, it's not so good as it could be if we had not discrimination against immigrants, right? In the US, this term multiracial society is discussed by these researchers here. Frank Bean, he's a professor in the sociology department at the University of California at Irvine. And they're pretty much saying that there is a color line that defines the black-white relationships in the US. Immigration for recent decades increased diversity in race ethnicity, as that book of Diversity Explosion that I mentioned by William Frey. So they're trying to understand, the main question is related to exactly this increase in diversity. What recent trends in intermarriage and multiracial identification reveal about these ethno-racial color lines in the contemporary immigrant America? So they pretty much use different sources of data here in order to try to explain what's going on, how is this process of integration, of increase in intermarriage and multiracial identification in the country. They use data from the 2000 US Census for that analysis. It was before the 2010 census was available. But they also do some qualitative interviews, so it's a mixed method approach, both using quantitative data from the 2000 census and a qualitative approach using in-depth interviews from multiracial individuals with Asia, Latino, and Black backgrounds. And they also do an extensive literature review from previous studies. And looking at all this data, these are their main findings. They have been seeing that intermarriage happens more often. Multiracial identification is more common in the US. And this process of intermarriage rates and multiracial identification is more frequent among immigrants than Blacks. I mentioned to you that I showed you some graphs about interracial marriage increasing in the US. Do you remember in which chapter I talk about that? Remember those graphs? The correct answer should be no, because I did not show those graphs yet. Those graphs are in the chapter about family. That was my mistake that I said some minutes ago. The graphs that I show, the increase in interracial marriage, increasing over time using Pew Research data survey, it's in the chapter about family. That's the next chapter after this one that we are talking about. You can take a look at those graphs that they are in that lecture. So the Black population in the US has lower levels of intermarriage and multiracial identification than immigrants. And then they mention that the African American population in the US still face a lot of barriers in order to integrate into the society and to have the same opportunity to the society. So there's still barriers to complete incorporation to the African American population. They have lower rates of intermarriage, although they have been increasing, as we're going to see in the next chapter, but they are lower than other groups. They have lower multiracial identification, so they consider themselves separated from other groups. They have higher rates of residential segregation. What does it mean, higher rates of residential segregation? That they are usually concentrated, they live usually more together in the same neighborhoods, and usually those neighborhoods have lower socioeconomic status as a whole, worse schools, worse infrastructure to the population, and so on, right? So there are a lot of studies in demography and sociology trying to understand these patterns of residential segregation and how that's bad for the African American population, because they have these high rates of residential segregation, which vary from one county to the other in the US. But by having that, it prevents them to integrate more into the American society, into having the same opportunities as the other people in the society. They also have lower levels of education attainment, and they have worse health outcomes compared to the other race ethnicity groups. So diversity is helping break down racial barriers. However, intermarriage and multiracial identification are higher among Asians and Latinos than Blacks. Disadvantage experienced by Asians and Latinos seems to be related to their immigrant background. So usually the disadvantage that we see from Asians and Latinos compared to the non-Hispanic white is more related to their immigrant background. So usually, yeah, okay, compared to the people who stayed back in their home country, they have better socioeconomic status, but compared to the whole society, they have lower socioeconomic status. But by the second generation, their children will reach similar levels of socioeconomic status as the white population. So Asians and Latinos who are second generation immigrants, at least second, third, and so on, they tend to have more similar socioeconomic outcomes as the Asian population. Sorry, as the white population. Disadvantage experienced by Blacks seems to be related to this enduring stigma and historical significance of Blackness, racism, and discrimination. Right? All topics that are being discussed right now in the US, all systemic racism and all these issues that we have been discussing more in public in more recent years. Just to be sure, I will just go to the website again, and just to show you that I'm not. Oh yeah, here in the lecture about international migration, I added another short video, 9 minutes long, from this professor, mentioning how immigration does not affect the earnings of the native population. They actually complement the needs, the demand for workers in the society. That's a short video, 9 minutes long, interesting to watch. I added it there. So, family and sexuality, this lecture here. It's the one that I have those, it's just hard to see the. Let me just show you in the next one. This one. These are the graphs that I want to say. Interracial marriage has been increasing in the US in these last years. This is based on Pew Research Center surveys, but it's still Blacks have lower rates than other groups. And Asians and Hispanics have a higher percentage of immigrants. In that previous lecture, we are comparing Blacks to other immigrants. Here, these are not broken down by being US born or immigrants, it's just by race ethnicity. So it has been increasing, but it's still lower than Hispanics and Asians, for example. Higher than whites, but lower than others. But I will talk more about this, breaking down by education, by race ethnicity and education, race ethnicity and sex, and so on. So those were the graphs that I was mentioning, but we're still going to see them in the next chapter. Cool? Nice, nice. This chapter here, this subsection of the lecture about race ethnicity, it's pretty much a paper written by Douglas Massey and his co-author. And Douglas Massey, I already mentioned him before here. He's a really well-known demographer in the US, maybe the demographer that knows more about international migration. He has been written books about and articles about theories of international migration and focusing on the migration from Mexico to the US. He has also been done a lot of work related to residential segregation and exactly the opportunities that the African American population still experience. So he's really well known in the demography world and outside that as well, of course. And in this specific paper here, and this paper is not cited in the textbook, so that's extra material that I'm putting here in the lecture. He talks about this process of Black hypersegregation. Whenever a group is highly segregated along multiple geographic dimensions, it is said to be hypersegregated. So they are not just trying to understand segregation as it was done in previous studies. They are trying to come up with this new measure, a measure that will try to see whether a specific group has really strong and high levels of segregation. So they created this concept of hypersegregation to describe metropolitan areas in which African Americans were really highly segregated. And they pretty much they created this new concept using 5 dimensions. 5 dimensions in which groups can be hypersegregated. If we look for a specific group on these 5 dimensions, and they have high levels of segregation in 4 of them, we say that that group has a hypersegregation pattern, right? What do they do? Which kind of data they use for this analysis? They use census tract data for 287 metropolitan areas that have consistent geographic boundaries from 1980 to 2010, okay? And these are the 5 dimensions: unevenness, isolation, clustering, concentration, centralization. They create this new indicator, or to be more specific, this index. And this index of hypersegregation is estimated using 5 indicators: the indicator of unevenness, of isolation, clustering, concentration, centralization. Unevenness is the degree to which blacks and whites are unevenly distributed across neighborhoods in the metropolitan area. So there is this uneven process in which blacks and whites live in that specific metropolitan area. Isolation, the extent to which African Americans live in predominantly black neighborhoods. Just looking at the African Americans and see if there is all this process, what's the percentage of those that live in neighborhoods that have at least 50% of African Americans? That's this other indicator of isolation that will be part of the hypersegregation index. Clustering, the degree to which neighborhoods inhabited by African Americans are clustered together in space. Let's say that we have one neighborhood that you have high concentration of African Americans right here. Let's say that we have this area, this screen here. That's a city, a metropolitan area. And here you have all the African Americans. This neighborhood here has more than 50% of African Americans. Let's say that this other here has more than 50% of African Americans. This one, the same thing, and this one, the same thing. The ones in the corner of the screen. In this case, there is not much clustering because they're really separated in the space. If, on the other hand, the 4 neighborhoods that were right here, one here, one here, one here, and one here, were more than 50% African Americans, then you have a higher process of clustering, because the 4 neighborhoods in which we have more African Americans, one is here, another one is here, another one is here, and another one is here. They're closer in space. If I had the other case in which it was this neighborhood, this neighborhood, this neighborhood, and this neighborhood, then they might have high levels of unevenness and isolation, but not necessarily of clustering. Concentration, the relative amount of physical space occupied by African Americans within a given metropolitan environment. So let's say these 4 neighborhoods here, that there is a low clustering. But does it have high concentration or not? How big is this space here? Is this small here? This small here? How is it? That's what concentration is trying to measure. Right? So if it's really small, you have a high concentration in this space. Or if those areas are bigger. Actually, this space here is bigger compared to the previous example. It's bigger here. It's bigger here. This is a really fancy way to show this. We don't have a whiteboard, so that's what I'm doing here. Just play with the tools that we have. If the space here is bigger, there is lower concentration. That's the relative amount of physical space occupied by African Americans. So they are just trying to measure all these different ways in which segregation can happen. Cool? And finally, centralization, the degree to which blacks reside near the center of a metropolitan area. And the center being downtown, in which that place that you have more services. So are they usually more concentrated here, or are they more living in farther away areas? In the US, farther away areas not necessarily have lower socioeconomic status, because like suburbs actually have several cities in the US better socioeconomic status than central areas, but it's another way to measure how they are distributed over space, right? On the space, on this metropolitan, within these metropolitan regions. Cool? There was my really fancy pen in this to show this. So these are the results on their analysis. This is, again, based on those metropolitan areas that they're analyzing between 1970 and 2010. And what are the number of metropolitan areas where African Americans were hyper-segregated? What's the number of them? So it declined from 40 to 21. So instead of 40 out of these metropolitan areas that they're analyzing that had hyper-segregation back in 1970, now you have only 21, just half of them. But looking at the index of hyper-segregation within this 20, looking at the index of hyper-segregation within this 40 back in 1970, the average segregation score did not change as much. It has been between 75 and 70, right? This 40 here had an index of hypersegregation of 75. This 20, yeah, decreased the number of cities, but the index is still at the same level, 70%. And this is the percentage of African Americans living in hypersegregated metropolitan areas. And in this case here, showing African Americans living in African Americans that are metropolitan residents, and African Americans all throughout the US, even rural areas, in small towns, and so on. So you see that both in 1970 and 2010, you had a higher percentage of African Americans living in metropolitan areas than living all over the US. So there is a higher concentration of African Americans in metropolitan areas. And overall, between 1970 and 2010, their share of the population has been declining, both within metropolitan areas and both all throughout the US. Exactly because now you have more immigrants coming from Latin America and Asia, their share of the population declined. We saw before that the overall share maintained constant between 2000 and 2010, but the overall in these last decades has been declining because of immigration. But what they are trying to show here the most is that African Americans have higher share of the population in metropolitan areas than overall in the US for both years that are shown in this graph, 1970 and 2010. Overall, this index has 5 indicators. So the word index is usually a summary of several indicators. We have 5 indicators here. And if out of these metropolitan areas that they were analyzing and getting data only from 2010, how many in percentage terms, how many of these metropolitan areas had at least high levels in all 5 indicators, 14% of them. Out of all these metropolitan areas, how many of them had at least high scores in 4 of the indicators? 18% of them, 21.1% in 3, 46.1% in 2 of them, and 0.8% in 1 of those indicators, right? And this is also a summary from this analysis. Here, again, focusing on data only in 2010, and looking at the 5 indicators of unevenness, isolation, clustering, concentration, centralization. And then the average of these 5 here is this one, and that's the final index of hypersegregation. These cities here are the cities that have high scores on all 5 dimensions. They have at least 60% in each one of these dimensions that are being analyzed. Baltimore, Birmingham, Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Flint, Milwaukee, St. Louis. And this is the average of each one of the indicators across these metropolitan areas. 64, the average here, and so on. See that these metropolitan areas here, we have heard about them in these last years. These areas here experience high levels of poverty, of inequality, and then we have been seeing social unrest in those areas. So this population is facing a lot of challenges in order to succeed in their lives, and they experience poverty, inequality, lower levels of education, poor worse with bad quality in their neighborhoods, not good job opportunities, and so on. And that's creating a lot of issues in those cities. We have those cities here, we have heard about them in recent years. And that's one point that it's highlighted in this paper, exactly because of this historical process of not giving opportunity for those people, now concentrated in fewer metropolitan areas. As we saw before, it dropped from 40 to 21 between 1970 and 2010. And these ones here are clear cases of we have to deal with those issues and give those people more opportunities. And these other ones have high scores on 4 dimensions. For example, Boston has high scores in all of them. Only in isolation, it's lower. And let me see another one that has a different one. Most of them that have a lower score is on isolation, but that they're lower than 60%. Oh, but Monroe has a lower index, lower than 60% on concentration, right? But is this just to show the trend that we saw here? Now, out of the 287 areas that they are analyzing, the number of those that have high, really, really high levels of segregation, hypersegregation, declined from 40 areas to 21. But the overall level of segregation among those remaining is still high. So there is a challenge for policymakers, for the government, to give better opportunities for people living in those areas, right? Flint, Michigan was a clear case with all the issue with the river and the polluted water that contaminated pretty much all the population, right, in those areas. So these are historical problems. They're not being dealt correctly, even by recent politicians and policymakers. So overall, in a summary here, until the 1960s, there was a high segregation. High segregation was almost universal across U.S. metropolitan areas. In 1970, 61% of all Black urban population live in one of 40 hyper-segregated metropolitan areas. This was nearly 50% of U.S. Black population. From 1970 to 2000, the hypersegregated areas declined from 40 to 21. And the average segregation within these areas decreased, but kind of like more stable than the number of areas that it dropped. In 2010, 1/3 of Black metropolitans live in hypersegregated areas. And hypersegregation is centered in a subset of metropolitan areas containing some of the largest Black communities. This last topic here is related to this table. Hypersegregation is centered in a subset of metropolitan areas. And it's also related to this topic here. But just one thing that I kind of like have to maybe correct myself here. Here, 61% of all Black urban population lived in one of 40 hypersegregated metropolitan areas. 1/3 of Black metropolitans lived in hypersegregated areas. That's related to this graph here. So just to be more specific, this is the percentage of African Americans living in hypersegregated metropolitan areas. So what I said before was not correct. What I'm saying here, to be really clear, is that back in 1970, 61% of African Americans that lived in metropolitan areas, they were living in areas that were hyper-segregated. In 1970, among all African Americans in the country, 47% of them were living in areas that were hyper-segregated. The overall amount of African Americans that now live in hyper-segregated areas declined. In 2010, among all African Americans in metropolitan that are metropolitan residents, 32% of them lived in hyper-segregated areas. Among all African Americans in the country, 26% of them lived in hyper-segregated areas. So I'm correcting myself. The previous interpretation I was not doing correct. I was interpreting this as more being the percentage of African Americans in those areas. This is the percentage of African Americans that lived in metropolitan areas in 1970 who were in hyper-segregated areas. So these are percentages of African Americans who were living in hyper-segregated areas back in 1970, back in 2010, in metropolitan areas in the whole US. In metropolitan areas in the whole US. The overall population of African Americans living in hyper-segregated areas declined overall, 47 to 26. Those living in metropolitan areas, also those living in hyper-segregated areas declined from 61 to 32, which is related to this. But it's still, those ones that still live in areas with high levels of segregation, with hyper-segregation, these ones here, or these ones here as well, that live in really high, hyper-segregated areas in metropolitan regions, these 32 are usually concentrated in a few of them. That's the main message that they want to explain, and that's the summary of this whole analysis, right? 1/3 of Black Americans live now, Black Americans who live in metropolitan areas live in hyper-segregated areas, and that dropped from 61% to 30%, right? This next subsection here of the chapter is related to also material outside of the textbook from this project called Opportunity Insights, based on Harvard. And the project is coordinated by Raj Chetty, who is an economist at Harvard. And they pretty much try to compare how the lives of Black and white population change or continue the same compared to the lives of their parents. So in order to do this kind of analysis, you have to have really, really refined data. You have to have the income of the parents back when older people now were children, and then you get the income of these older people now in compared to their parents. So it's pretty much like you get my income now, and compare my income with the income of my parents when I was a child. So I'm trying to measure intergenerational mobility. I want to know if at the time that I was a child, the income of my parent was higher or smaller than the income that I have right now. And that's this whole dynamic. And this kind of data is really difficult to get access to. And that's what I'm going to explain in the next lecture. So probably we just have like 3 lectures left. So probably what's going to happen here, we are going to finish this chapter about race ethnicity. And I also hope to finish about family and sexuality. I don't think we're going to have time to cover the chapter about contraception and birth control. So probably the final exam, which is going to happen after Thanksgiving, is going to cover only these 2 chapters about race, ethnicity, and the family and sexuality. But we will know that for sure in our last lecture, okay? 2 Tuesdays from now. So that's it for 30. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend. Take your time to take the 3rd attempt of exam 3. If you have any more questions, some people wanted to ask questions. I tried to answer them here to everybody, but if you want to ask more questions and have one-on-one Zoom meetings, just email me and we can set up a time. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend. Thank you.